Jenny Fielding is Mrs. Sanderson now. She has a husband, 2 daughters, Julia and Marjorie, and 3 grandchildren. Every year, Julia and Marjorie send new school photographs of the grandchildren, Angus, Alice and Rose. Mrs. Sanderson arranges them on the sideboard. On the wall hangs Mr. Sanderson's school photograph. It's black and white and 1 metre long, the whole school in it together. One after another, Angus, Alice and Rose have asked, "Grandpa, how was it done?" Mr. Sanderson explains that once all school photographs were like that and had to be taken with a special camera. Everybody was arranged in a huge semicircle, and the camera, which was clockwork, slowly turned, panning from one end of the curve to the other. Mr. Sanderson is in the middle of the 4th row, looking very young and serious, but at either end of the 2nd row are the Schofield triplets. Really, they were twins, Marcus and Ben, Mr. Sanderson tells them, and they were standing one each end of the row. When the camera got halfway round, Ben left his place and ran along the back of the others faster than the camera was moving, and went to stand beside Marcus at the other end. They got into a terrible row when they were found out, but we all thought they were heroes. Angus, Alice and Rose looked closely at Grandpa's school photograph to admire the heroic Schofield twins. Ben at one end, Ben and Marcus at the other. "Did you have a school photograph, Granny?" Rose asks. "I did once," Mrs. Sanderson says, "but I must have lost it." She hates lying, but if she told the truth about her school photograph, no one would believe her. At the back of her dressing table drawer is Jenny Fielding's school photograph, still rolled into a cylinder as it was on the day she first brought it home 40 years ago. She's never shown it to anyone since. Jenny was 13 when the notice was given out in assembly that the photographer was coming. Miss Shaw, the form teacher, had a few more words of her own to add. "You will all make sure that your uniforms are clean and that your hair is tidy. There will be a rehearsal on Friday so that each girl knows where she's to stand. And wherever you stand on Friday," said Miss Shaw, fixing them with an iron gaze, "you will stand on Monday. There are always certain people who imagine that it's amusing to run from one end of the line to the other in order to appear twice. Anyone who does that will be dealt with severely. Do I make myself clear?" In the back row, Jenny's great friend, Marjorie Fletcher, turned her head slightly and muttered to Jenny, "I bet it will be one of us. I have a feeling." "Did you speak, Marjorie?" Miss Shaw inquired. "I just said I might get my hair cut," Marjorie said pleasantly, "for the photograph." "An excellent idea," said Miss Shaw. Marjorie's hair, like Jenny's, was wild and dark and curly. They were very alike in other ways too, and were often mistaken for each other. They were best friends. They went everywhere together, near enough. It had come as no surprise when this announcement was made in assembly. Bush Telegraph had seen to that. So it was already public knowledge that after the rehearsal on Friday morning, the lottery would take place. Friday involved a great deal of standing about in a chilly, damp wind on the lawn in front of the school. In the centre of the lawn stood a long, curved row of 80 chairs, with a row of benches behind them and a row of tables behind that. One after another, the classes stepped forward to take their places. The 3rd year stood on the grass behind the 6th form and staff. The 4th year stood behind them on the benches, and at the back, the 5th forms teetered on the tables. Jenny and Marjorie found themselves facing each other across the grass at opposite ends of the 3rd year. And Jenny was remembering what Marjorie had said last week. "I bet it will be one of us." Jenny was on the left, the end that the camera started from. The entrants for the lottery met at the back of the sports pavilion after lunch. Jenny from the 3rd year, Madeline Enderby from the 2nd year, Dawn Fuggle from the 4th, and Glenda Alcott from the 5th. All the left-hand tail-enders, except for the first year, who were considered too young, and the sixth form, who were above such things. Glenda was there before them, holding her blue felt school hat, in which lay 4 tightly folded pieces of paper. 3 of these are blank, Glenda said. 1 carries the black spot. Whoever draws the black spot is the one that changes ends. As soon as the camera is pointing to the middle, you leave your place and run to the other end of the line. Are you prepared to risk it? The other 3 nodded solemnly. All right, then. Draw your papers, said Glenda. Jenny just stared at her folded paper, remembering what Marjorie had said. I bet it will be one of us. I have a feeling. Marjorie had had feelings before. She had had a feeling that she would be singing the descant in Adeste Fidelis, and then Susan Beale lost her voice just before they were due to start. I have a feeling Cranmer House won't win the acting prize this year, Marjorie had said the day before the drama competition, although Cranmer House were a dead cert. And sure enough, on the day, Cranmer fluffed their lines and missed their cues, and the cup was awarded to Beckett House. Marjorie and Jenny were in Beckett. Marjorie's feelings always seemed to involve misfortune for someone, but you couldn't blame Marjorie for that. She hadn't given Susan laryngitis or nobbled the entire cast of Cranmer's play. Open your papers, Glenda said, and Jenny unfolded the little wad in her hand. She hardly needed to look. She knew it would be her paper that bore the black spot. Nobody must tell anyone else who's won except you, Jenny, Glenda said. You must appoint a liaison officer. If you're going to come down with something at the last moment, you must let us know so that we 3 can draw again. Jenny knew there was no chance of that, or Marjorie would have mentioned it. But she had to do what Glenda said, just in case. Will you be my liaison officer? Jenny asked Marjorie, who showed no surprise when Jenny handed her the black spot. No need, said Marjorie. If anything happens to you, I'll run instead. People will think it's you anyway. Actually, she added, I have a feeling I may have to do it. Why, am I going to drop dead before Monday? Jenny snapped. Suddenly she felt she'd had enough of Marjorie and her feelings. On Monday morning she made herself especially tidy, as demanded, for the photograph. Waiting in the form room for assembly, everyone preened and checked each other out, so Jenny had only just noticed Marjorie was not in the room before Miss Shaw appeared at the door and beckoned her out. Jenny, Miss Shaw said, I wanted a word with you before I told the others. I know Marjorie's a friend of yours. Jenny did not have feelings, not the way Marjorie did, but she knew what was coming. Marjorie had an accident yesterday, Miss Shaw said. She was out for a drive with some family friends, and the car door wasn't properly shut. Marjorie was thrown out into the road when they took a bend too sharply. I'm afraid she's badly hurt. At break, the news was all round the school. Glenda Alcott came to find Jenny. You needn't run if you don't want to, Glenda said kindly. We'll understand. I'll be all right, Jenny said. She knew that if she had the photograph to worry about, she might not have to think of Marjorie lying in the hospital. Listen, said Glenda. Someone told me they'd do it twice, just in case anyone does run. The first time, they don't run the film. Well, that's how they did it at my brother's school. They stood tier upon tier. Jenny looked across that great curve to the place where Marjorie ought to have been standing, and did not move. Glenda had been right. After the camera had swept round, the little photographer blew his whistle, said, All right, ladies, let's do it once more, and redirected the camera on its tripod towards Jenny's end of the line. He sounded his whistle again. Very slowly, the camera began to turn a second time. The first time she had counted the seconds until it seemed to have reached the headmistress. When the moment came, she took a step backwards, turned, and began to run. She hadn't thought what it would be like behind the curve. The backs of the fifth years standing on their tables reared above her. A palisade of legs, a swathe of skirts, battlement of heads. The curve seemed endless. She ran faster, racing her hidden adversary. 3 yards from the end of the line, she slipped. Her foot skidded from under her and she fell flat. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late to run on. As she rose upright, there was a surge of muted laughter and conversation. The camera had got there first. Glenda, who had seen her leave and been able to see also that she'd not arrived at the far end, jumped down from the table and hurried round to find out what had happened. "Did you fall? Bad luck." "Oh, hey, don't cry," Glenda said when she found Jenny weeping on the grass. Madeline and Dawn were not so charitable. "One of us could have run," Madeline grumbled. "Jenny has something on her mind," Glenda said, severely, and the other two became all at once very serious. Jenny's mother came to the school at the end of the afternoon to meet Jenny and take her home. Marjorie had died just after 2 o'clock, while they were having the photograph taken. Everyone at school was sympathetic until the photographs arrived. And then the storm broke, for there was Jenny, standing on the left-hand side of the picture, and there at the far end was Jenny again, looking a little dishevelled and blurred. "It isn't me," Jenny kept saying. "I never got there. I fell over." She was, as promised, severely dealt with, and everyone despised her for not admitting to what she'd done when the evidence was there in black and white. Except for 3 people. Glenda, Madeline, and Dawn had all been watching the far end, and they alone knew she had never got there. Glenda borrowed a magnifying glass, and they studied that little figure at the right hand of the photograph. "It could be you," she said finally. What she didn't say, and what they were all thinking was, it could be Marjorie. This is why Mrs. Sanderson keeps her school photograph in a drawer instead of hanging it on the wall beside her husband's. Even now, 40 years later, she can't bring herself to explain. That was In Black and White by Jan Mark. It was abridged for radio by Peter Carey and read by Anne Rye. In Black and White was produced in Manchester by Martin Jameson.
In 1956, 10 pence was 2 shillings, and it was still a fortnight's pocket money. And the 2-shilling piece we got from Mr. Tate in 1956 was old, even in those days. Mr. Tate lived farther down the street, and everyone said he was a miser. His house was shabby and unpainted, and he looked miserable. That Saturday, we had 2 half-crowns, that's 5 shillings, all right, 25 pence, which Gary's mum had given him to buy a jar of pickle and some potatoes from the corner shop. Mr. Tate was ahead of us, buying bread and cheese, which he paid for with a 2-shilling piece. Mrs. Goldman looked at it very hard before she put it in the till. "It's a perfectly good one," Mr. Tate said testily. Mrs. Goldman held it up, and we noticed how black it looked. Then she put it in the till. Mr. Tate had been scowling across the counter at her, but as the till drawer closed, he suddenly smiled, raised his hat, and almost bowed out of the shop. "Now, what can I do for you boys?" Mrs. Goldman said. "A jar of pickle and 10 pounds of King Edward's," Gary recited. Gary handed her the 2 half-crowns. In return, Mrs. Goldman gave him a 2-shilling piece in change, the very 2 shillings that Mr. Tate had just given her. She was glaring something awful while she was holding out the money, because Gary didn't take it at first. We looked hard at the 2 bob. It seemed okay, but it was very black. "It's a perfectly good one," Mrs. Goldman snapped. We jumped. Mrs. Goldman looked really angry. Her hand, with the coin in the palm, was shaking. Gary picked it up and dropped it in his pocket. We took a handle of the shopping basket each and went out of the shop. We heard Mrs. Goldman call out, "Goodbye, boys. See you soon." "She's changed her tune," I said. Gary shrugged moodily. He was slouching, and the shopping bag dipped annoyingly on his side, so that the lumpy King Edwards banged against my legs. "Quit shoving," Gary snarled, when I jerked at the bag to level it. "What's eating you?" I said. Gary had been in a perfectly good mood 5 minutes before. Now he was scowling. The same expression he wore when Mr. Carter whacked him at school. "I don't know." He looked me in the eye. "I just feel horrible." We were level with his front door by then. We went in and reached the kitchen table where Gary dumped the shopping bag. "Got the pickles?" his mum said. She could see the potatoes spilling out of the bag. "Got the change?" Gary delved into his pocket and dropped the coin on the table, and smiled. In that second, his whole mood changed. "Can I have my pocket money?" he said. "Already?" his mum groaned. Only minutes ago, Gary had acted as if he had no more than days to live. Now he was grinning as usual. "Oh, Mom, it's 2 weeks." He was looking at the 2-shilling piece we'd got from the shop. "OK, take the 2 bob," she said. Gary scooped up the 2 bob and we zipped out the back door. "What do you say?" Mrs. Sutton yelled after us. "Ta," said Gary. He was down in the mouth again, dragging his feet as we crossed the yard and went through the gate into the back lane. "Come on," I said. "Let's go up the wreck." "I don't care where we go," Gary said. I couldn't understand it. Gary never sulked, and if anything was bothering him, he talked about it. But today he wasn't talking, though I thought he might say something when he saw who was there ahead of us. In one corner of the wreck stood a pair of swings, and suspended upside down from the crossbar of one of the swings was Trevor Passmore. He was hanging by his knees. When he saw us, he swung down and strutted towards us. We stood in awe of Trevor, partly because he was a lot bigger than us, and partly because he said that underpants were sissy and refused to wear any. Now he came up to us and said, "Bet you can't hang upside down on them swings." Gary stared at him mournfully and started to walk on, but Trevor dodged in front of him. "Bet you wouldn't dare hang upside down from them swings," Passmore intoned, lolloping round like an incompetent wolf. At last, Gary raised his head, gave Passmore a long, serious look, and changed direction towards the swings. "Hold that for us," he said, and dropped the contents of his trouser pockets into my hands. With one bound, he was swarming up the support of the left-hand swing. But I wasn't looking at him. I wasn't looking at anything. There was a leaden feeling at the back of my head, a dreadful heaviness, I knew there was no hope. Up above, Gary was dangling, yelling insults at Passmore. I turned my eyes upward to watch him. Poor Gary. Didn't he know it was meaningless? Gary lowered himself to the ground. He pranced over to where I was standing. "Wake up!" Gary bawled cheerfully. "Give us me things!" He held out his hands, and I dropped into them all the objects he had given me to hold. "That was brilliant," I said. "It's nothing," Gary said. The sad look was back in his eyes. He just sighed and turned away. I knew how he felt. Then I realized why I knew how he felt. I turned my back on Passmore and ran after him. "Gary," I said, "lend us 2 bob." Gary simply held out his hand with the coin in it. "Keep it," he said. "Go on. I don't want it any more." I flicked it out of his palm with my fingernail. The coin spun away into the grass, and Gary shot after it. "What you do that for?" he yelled. "That's 2 weeks' money." "Wait." I grabbed his sleeve. "Don't pick it up. Listen. Why did you give it to me?" Gary stopped and thought. "I didn't want it," he said at last. "I didn't want anything. I wished I was dead. I couldn't understand why I was alive." "I know," I told him, "and nor could I, while I was looking after your things." Gary looked at me. "While you were holding my money." The 2 bob was lying in front of us on a patch of bald earth. "Hey, what say we test it?" I said. "We could give it to someone we don't like, just to see what happens." Gary was prodding the coin with a twig. "What about old Carter?" Of course, doing it to a teacher didn't seem quite so unfair, and there wasn't much Mr. Carter didn't know about unfairness. Gary stood guard over the 2 shillings while I went home for the coal tongs, a paper bag, and some string. We picked up the coin with the tongs, dropped it in the bag, and tied the neck with string. Then we tied the end to Gary's twig and walked back, holding the bag at arm's length. The bag spent the rest of the weekend in Gary's outside lav on the top of the cistern. On Monday morning, Gary looked pretty sick after registration when he carried the money to the front and laid it on Mr. Carter's desk, even though we'd put it in an envelope. I saw Gary swallow hard as he said, "Please, sir, will you look after this money for me till dinner time?" Mr. Carter took the envelope and shoved it in his pocket. We lined up for assembly after that, and we were halfway through Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven, before Gary nudged me and nodded in Mr. Carter's direction. Mr. Carter was slumped forward with his head in his hands. When we all stood up at the end and filed out, Mr. Carter stayed where he was, until Miss Lewis walked over and touched him on the shoulder. English with Mr. Carter was due to start at 11:45, but it was 10 to 12 before the classroom door opened, and Miss Lewis walked in. Gary put up his hand and said, "Please, miss, what's happened to Sir?" "Mr. Carter is unwell," Miss Lewis said. A horrid thought struck me. "He hasn't gone home, has he?" I said. If he'd left the premises with the 2 bob. "I don't see what business it is of yours," Miss Lewis said, "but no, he hasn't." After the dinner bell rang, we hurried to the staff room, but before we got there, I happened to glance out the window. At the end of the front drive was Mr. Carter, just turning into the street. Without a word, we were off. Mr. Carter was well ahead of us, but not walking very fast. He kept right on, head down, shoulders hunched, and we realized he was heading for the station. Only he wasn't. When he reached the station approach, he crossed over it and went on, up onto the railway bridge. Now we were crossing the station approach, and we could see Mr. Carter's figure outlined against the sky as he reached the highest part of the bridge. And then he stopped. "Oh, God," said Gary, and broke into a run. I ran after him, for up there, on the bridge, Mr. Carter had got one knee on the parapet. "Sir!" My voice had become a breathy squeak. "No, sir!" Then a train went onto the bridge, an express that wasn't stopping at the station, and Gary and Mr. Carter vanished in a boiling cloud of steam. When it cleared, Gary was holding Mr. Carter by the belt of his raincoat, and Mr. Carter was climbing down off the parapet. "Oh, sir!" Gary was as frightened as I was. "Can I have that £2 you were keeping for me, sir?" Mr. Carter reached into his pocket, drew out the envelope, and handed it to Gary, who took it by one corner, pinched in his fingernails. Mr. Carter looked slightly stunned. "Right," he said, briskly. "Back to school. Can't think why we're hanging about here, can you?" And he strode off, without another glance at us. I suddenly understood what people meant when they talked about someone turning up like a bad penny. And so Gary performed the noblest deed of his life. He took the £2 bit, 2 weeks' pocket money, and dropped it in the canal. When we went home that afternoon, Mr. Tate was out on the pavement, painting his front door bright red. "Just a moment, lads," he said as we went by. "Do you remember on Saturday you came into the corner shop just after me? I paid with a 2-shilling piece, and Mrs. Goldman's ready to swear she gave it to you two as change. You don't still have it by any chance?" I felt Gary jump. "No, sorry," he said. "We must have spent it." "Was it special then?" I couldn't help asking. "It was the first money I ever earned," Mr. Tate said. "I took it home to give to my mother, but she said to keep it for good luck. I've had it in my waistcoat pocket ever since. Not always the same waistcoat." That may well have been Mr. Tate's first joke. I've often wondered since if he ever realised exactly the kind of luck his first wages had brought him. I've also wondered what his first employer was like, although I think I can guess. That was Old Money by Jan Mark. It was abridged for radio by Peter Carey and read by Malcolm Rayburn. Old Money was produced in Manchester by Martin Jameson.
Yes, even the most mundane things like a 2-shilling piece can be a source of horror in the 7th dimension. And so it will prove next week when a man dresses up the newel post at the bottom of his stairs to look like a person with terrible consequences. In another tale from Black and White.
The house was not old enough to be interesting, just old enough to be falling apart. The few interesting things had been dealt with ages ago when they first moved in. There was a bell push in every room, connected to a glass case in the kitchen, which contained a list of names: parlour, drawing room, master bedroom, second bedroom, back bedroom. "What are they for?" said Libby one morning. At that moment, Martin pushed the button in the front room and the indicator slid up to parlour while the bell rang. "To fetch up the maid," said Mum. "We haven't got a maid," said Libby. "No, but you've got me," said Mum, and tied an old sock over the bell. The mouse holes in the kitchen looked interesting too. The mice were bold and lounged about. They sat on the draining board and could scarcely be bothered to stir themselves. Mum minded the mice less than the bells until the day she found footprints in the frying pan. "Sorry, lads, the party's over," she said to the mice, and the mouse holes were blocked up. Dad did the blocking up, and the house stopped being interesting altogether. For a time. Libby and Martin did what they could to improve matters. They worked their way through the house, tapping walls, floors, and scouring cupboards, but there were no hidden cavities, no secret doors. And what they found in the attic didn't please anyone. "Oh, no," said Dad. "That's dry rot. Thank God this isn't our house," and went cantering off to visit the estate agents, Tench and Tench, in the high street. Dad called them Shark and Shark. When Dad came back, he was growling. "Shark Jr. says that since the whole row is coming down inside 2 years, it isn't worth bothering about." "What did Shark Sr. say?" said Mum. "I don't believe there is a Shark Sr.," said Dad. "I think he's dead. I think young Shark keeps him in a box under the bed." "Don't be nasty," said Mum, looking at Libby, who worried about things under the bed, even in broad daylight. "I just hope we find a house of our own before this place collapses on our heads." She went back to sewing. Martin ran upstairs, rhyming, "Mr. Shark, in the dark, under the bed, dead." When he came down again, Mum was putting away the sewing, and Libby was parading around in the hall in a pointed hat with a veil and a long red dress made of old curtains. "What are you meant to be?" said Martin. "I'm Sleeping Beauty's mother," said Libby, and lowering her head she charged along the hall, pointed hat foremost, like a unicorn. Martin changed his mind about walking downstairs and slid down the banisters instead. As he reached the upright post at the bottom of the stairs, Mum came out of the back room and just missed being impaled on Libby's hat. "Stop rushing up and down," said Mum. "You'll ruin those clothes. I've only just finished them. And you," she said, turning to Martin, "stop swinging on that newel post." The newel post was supposed to be holding up the banisters, but possibly it was the other way about. At the foot, it was just a polished wooden post, but further up, it had been turned on a lathe with slender hips, a waist, and square shoulders. On top was a round ball, as big as a head. There was another at the top of the stairs, but it had lost its head. Dad called it Anne Boleyn. The one at the bottom was simply a newel post, but Libby thought that this too was its name. Newel Post. Like Anne Boleyn or Libby Anderson. When she talked to it, she just called it Newel. The pointed hat and the old curtains were Libby's costume for a school play. Martin knew all of Libby's lines as she chanted them round the house, up and down the stairs in a strained, jerky voice, one syllable per step. "My dear, we must invite all the fairies to the christening. Hello, Newell. We will not invite the wicked fairy." On the last day of term, he sat with Mum and Dad in the school hall and watched Libby go through the same routine on stage. Once the holidays began, Libby went back to talking like Libby, although she still wore the pointed hat and the curtains until they began to drop to pieces. The curtains went for dusters, but the pointed hat was around for a long time until Mum picked it up and threatened, "Take this thing away or it goes in the dustbin." Libby shunted up and down the stairs a few times with the hat on, and then Mum called out that Jane next door had come to play. If Libby had been at the top, she might have left the hat on her bed. But she was almost at the bottom, so she plonked it down on Newell's cannonball head and went out to fight Jane over whose turn it was to kidnap the teddy bear. The hat definitely did something for Newell. When Martin came in later, he thought at first that it was a person standing at the foot of the stairs. He had to look twice before he understood who it was. Martin began to get ideas. The hat made the rest of Newell look very undressed. So he fetched down the old housecoat that had been hanging behind the bathroom door when they moved in. It was purple and very worn. Turning it front to back, he buttoned it like a bib round Newell's neck so that it hung down to the floor. He filled 2 gloves with screwed-up newspaper, poked them into his sleeves, and pinned them there. The weight made the arms dangle. He put a pair of football boots under the hem of the housecoat with just the toes sticking out, and stood back. In the darkness of the hall, it looked just like a person waiting, although there was something not so much lifelike as deathlike in the hang of those dangling arms. Mum and Libby first saw Newell as they came out of the kitchen together. "What do you think?" said Martin. "Horrible thing," said Mum, but she didn't ask him to take it down. Libby sidled round Newell and ran upstairs as close to the wall as she could get. When Dad came home from work, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Hello, who's that?" Before Martin put on the light and showed him. "An idol, I suppose," said Dad. "Newell, god of dry rot." And he bowed low at the foot of the stairs. At the same time, the hat slipped forward slightly, as if Newell had lowered its head in acknowledgment. Martin also bowed low before reaching up to put the hat straight. Mum and Dad seemed to think that Newell was rather funny, so it stayed at the foot of the stairs. They never bowed to it again, but Martin did, every time he went upstairs, and so did Libby. Libby didn't talk to Newell anymore, but she watched it a lot. At night, the house creaked. "It's the furniture warping," said Mum. Libby thought she said that the furniture was walking, and she could well believe it. The dressing table had feet with claws. Why shouldn't it walk in the dark, tugging fretfully this way and that because the clawed feet pointed in opposite directions? She hid under the bedclothes. In his bedroom, Martin heard the creaks too, but he had a different reason for worrying. In the attic, where the dry rot lurked, there was a big oak wardrobe full of old dead ladies' clothes. It was directly over his head. Supposing it came through? Next day, he moved the bed. The vacuum cleaner had lost its casters and had to be helped by Libby pushing from behind. It skidded up the hall and knocked Newell's football boots askew. When Martin came in, he set them side by side, but later they were kicked out of place again. Martin put the right boot where the left had been, and the left boot on the bottom stair. When he left it, the veil on the hat was hanging down behind. But as he went upstairs after tea, he noticed that it was now draped over Newell's right shoulder, as if Newell had turned its head to see where its feet were going. That night, the creaks were louder than ever. Martin felt fairly safe because he had worked out that if the wardrobe fell tonight, it would land on his chest of drawers and not on him. Then he realized that the creaks were coming not from above, but from below. He held his breath. Downstairs didn't creak. His alarm clock gleamed greenly in the dark and told him that it had gone 2 o'clock. Mum and Dad were asleep ages ago. Libby would sooner burst than leave her bed in the dark. Feeling noble and reckless, he put on the bedside lamp, slid out of bed, trod silently across the carpet. He turned on the main light and opened the door. The glow shone out of the doorway and saw him as far as the top of the stairs. From the top of the stairs he could look down into the hall where the street light opposite shone coldly through the frosted panes of the front door. It shone on the hall stand where the coats hung, on the blanket chest and the brass jug that stood on it, and on the broody telephone that never rang at night. It did not shine on Newell. Newell was not there. Newell was halfway up the stairs, one hand on the banisters and one hand holding up the housecoat, clear of its boots. The veil on the hat drifted like smoke across the frosted glass of the front door. Newell creaked and came up another step. Martin turned, fled back to the bedroom and dived under the bedclothes. "Were you reading in bed last night?" said Mum, prodding him awake the next morning. Martin came out from under the bedclothes very slowly. "No, Mum." "You went to sleep with the light on, both lights," she said, leaning across to switch off the one by the bed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Perhaps you'd like to pay the next electricity bill." Mum had brought him up a cup of tea, which meant that she had been down to the kitchen and back again unscathed. He drank his tea, dressed, and went along the landing. He looked down into the hall where the sun shone through the frosted glass of the front door, on the hall stand, the blanket chest, the brass jug, and the telephone. It shone on Newell, standing with its back to him at the foot of the stairs. Martin went down and sat on the blanket chest, looking at Newell. It was time for Newell to go. He should walk up to Newell this minute, kick away the boots, rip off the housecoat, throw away the hat, but the breeze from an open window stirred the hem of the housecoat and revealed the wooden post beneath it, rooted firmly in the floor, as it had been for 70 years. There were no feet in the boots, no arms in the sleeves. If he destroyed Newell, it would mean he believed that he had seen Newell climbing the stairs. But if he left Newell alone, Newell might walk again. He had a problem. That was Newell by Jan Mark. It was abridged for radio by Peter Carey and read by Malcolm Rayburn. Newell was produced in Manchester by Martin Jameson.
Rachel's house had a very small garden. Rachel's mum could have done with a bit more room, because she liked growing things and there was not much scope for gardening, but she made the most of what space there was. Along the back fence by the alley, there were sprouts and cabbages with fringes of radishes in between, and down either side were flowers. Mum even had little bushes growing in old buckets on the concrete up by the back door. So the whole garden was a carpet of grass and plants, except for one threadbare patch, the size of a large hearthrug, right next to the house. Nothing grew there. Mum couldn't understand it. It was a good sunny spot, sheltered from the wind, but it made no difference what she planted. Nothing came up. She tried carrots and lettuce first, and when they failed she put in onions, then beetroot, then marrows, and finally nasturtiums, which are difficult not to grow. "Must be the drains," Gran said. "You ought to get the council to have a look. It might be typhoid." "I'd have thought bad drains would be good for plants," said Mum. "Ever see a carrot with typhoid?" Gran sniffed. By the time they'd lived in the house for 3 years, Rachel's little sister Donna had been born. Gran had moved to Maidstone, Rachel was at the junior school, and Dad suddenly started to be interested in budgerigars. Gran had kept a blue budgerigar called Pip in a cage on the sideboard, but Dad didn't approve of birds like that. "Is it cruel to keep them in cages, then?" Rachel asked. I don't know about cruel, Dad said. It doesn't look natural to me. Full-grown bird standing on one leg with a bell on its head saying, "Who's a pretty boy, then?" So, on the bald patch, where nothing grew, he built an aviary. First he put down concrete, and over this went a tall enclosure of wire netting on a frame of battens. At one end was a wooden sentry box with perches. At the weekend, Dad and Rachel took the bus and spent the afternoon looking in the woods for good sound branches so that the birds would have somewhere to sit, like wild birds. They brought them home and set them up in the aviary. Then the budgerigars arrived. There were 6 of them, and they came in little cardboard boxes with holes in the sides. Dad took them into the aviary and let them loose. "What are we going to call them?" Rachel said. "Not going to call them anything," Dad said. "They don't need names. And another thing," he said sternly to Rachel and Mum and Donna, who'd come out to watch, "I don't want anyone trying to teach them to talk. There's going to be trouble if I catch any of them creeping up to me and saying, 'Who's a pretty boy, then?'" Rachel watched the budgerigars exploring their new home, bouncing on the branches and tidying their feathers. When the birds settled, they began to purr and chirrup in the sunshine. "See," said Dad, "they can talk to each other. Those squawks are all the language they need. They mean something." "So do words," Rachel said. "Not to budgerigars," Dad said firmly. "They don't really talk. They just copy sounds." It was a fine August that year. The budgerigars had been in residence for almost 6 weeks, when Dad came home from work one evening in a bad mood. They could tell he was in a bad mood by the way he shut the kitchen door. He always came in through the back gate and paused to have a look at the birds on his way past the aviary before coming indoors. Tonight, he didn't stop in the kitchen. He went straight through to the front room where Rachel and Mum were watching television. "Own up, then," he said. "Who did it?" "Who did what?" said Mum. "Who's been at the birds?" he said. "Well, have they got out, then?" Mum looked alarmed. "Rachel, have you been fiddling?" "Oh, they're all there," said Dad. "And one of them's talking. Who did it?" "What did it say?" Rachel asked. She hoped it had not said hello. She always said it herself as she passed the aviary on her way to school. Not to teach them, just to be friendly. "Stop acting innocent," said Dad. "Come and listen." They went out to the aviary. One of the birds was white, more noticeable than the others and more sociable. When the white bird saw the family standing round, it flew up to a branch and sidled along until it was close to the wire. "Pretty me," it said. "Hear that?" Dad demanded. "Pretty me. Oh, give it pretty me. Who's been saying pretty me to that bird?" Rachel was not quite sure if this was what the bird had said. The words had come out muffled and rather subdued, not at all like Pip's self-satisfied croak. She wished it would speak again, but it only sat there on its branch, the little wrinkled eyelids crimping up and down. "If any of those birds says another word, there'll be trouble," said Dad. He was looking at Rachel. After tea, when Dad had gone to play darts at the Man of Kent, Rachel slipped out into the aviary again. The white bird was still sitting on its twig, next to the wire. Rachel went and stood close. The white bird opened its eyes and its beak. "Pretty me," it said in its sad, hoarse voice. "Pretty me. Pretty me." Rachel's first thought was, "Good, it isn't copying anything I've said." Then she began to wonder who it was copying. Surely no one would deliberately teach a budgerigar to say, "Pity me." Perhaps Mum had said it without thinking. But people didn't say things like that without thinking. Perhaps the bird had tried to say pretty me, but couldn't talk very well. "Pity me," said the white bird. One of the green budgerigars, there were 2 of them, fluttered down and clung with beak and claws to the wire netting. It turned its head sideways to look at her. "Pity me," said the green bird. The two yellow birds clambered up from below. "Pity me," they said. Rachel shivered. She'd not noticed the sun was down below the roofs of the houses. The aviary was in shadow, and she could only just make out the shape of the blue budgerigar, hunched on its perch in the shelter, in silence. The next day was Saturday, mild and still, and in the morning the budgerigars swung and fluttered in the aviary with never a word to say. They nibbled at the chickweed, honed their beaks on cuttlefish bones, and chucked millet seeds about, very busy being budgerigars. But as the day wore on, an uneasy silence settled over the aviary. Rachel went over to the netting. A yellow budgerigar opened one eye and said, "Oh, I'm so cold. Oh, I'm so cold." "Pity me," said the white bird. The others ruffled their feathers and were motionless again. "Cross my heart," said Rachel later that evening. "Cross my heart and cut my throat, it wasn't me." "None of that nonsense," said Dad. "I want a straight answer, yes or no. Did you or didn't you?" "No," Rachel yelled. She was shocked at herself. People didn't yell at Dad. "Anyway, if I had, I wouldn't have taught them to say things like that. I'd have taught them, 'Who's a pretty boy, then?'" said Dad. "Yes, but I didn't," said Rachel. It was raining on Sunday. The budgerigars stayed in their shelter and looked at the weather with their small eyes half shut and said nothing all day. Dad was on late shift the following week, from 4 till midnight, so he saw the birds only in the daytime when it was bright, and they were bright. But it seemed to Rachel they were not so bright as they had been, and after Dad left for work, wheeling his bicycle down the alley, she visited the aviary. The birds that had stopped flying settled on their twigs and shuffled towards her. All of them, all 6. They looked furtive and unwell. "Pity me," said the white bird. "Pity me. I'm so cold," said the 2 yellow birds. "Cold as clay," said the blue bird that had never spoken before. Rachel jumped and turned around. Mum was standing behind her, lips pressed together, tight and frightened. "Don't say anything to your Dad," said Mum. "I'm going to watch this evening. Someone must be coming into the garden after dark and doing this." Mum watched every evening that week and caught no one. By the weekend, the birds had stopped squawking and flying from twig to twig. The chickweed withered untouched. The millet sprays hung neglected from the branches. On Saturday morning, Dad and Mum and Rachel stood round the aviary and listened to the listless little voices droning. "Oh, I'm so cold. Cold as clay. Pity me." "This is getting beyond a joke," Dad said, and talked of calling the police. They all looked at the bedraggled birds, with their feathers poking out at all angles like bristles on a bottle brush, and their dreary eyes. "What could the police do?" Mum said. "Question them?" On Monday, the last day of October, Dad was back at work on the night shift and didn't leave home until 20 to 12. Rachel heard him go, kept awake by the continual opening and closing all evening of the back door, as Mum and Dad took turns to leap out on the intruder, but they didn't catch anyone. When Dad's rear light had turned left at the end of the alley, Rachel crept downstairs. Mum was clearing up before going to bed, but she sat down at the table. Rachel padded into the kitchen. "I don't know," she sighed. "Those blooming budgies. We've been in and out 12 times this evening. We haven't heard anyone." "I don't think there's anyone to hear," said Rachel. "I don't think there's anyone there at all. Only the birds can hear it." When Dad came home from work next morning, he found Mum and Rachel standing by the aviary, watching the budgerigars that drooped on their branches. "Oh, I'm so cold," said one. "I shall always be cold," said another. "Cold as clay." "I shall always be here," said a third. "I shall never go away," said the white bird. "Pity me." "No," Dad shouted. "We are not moving. I never heard such nonsense. We're staying here." "Right," said Mum. "Then it's up to you. Either those birds go or I do." The budgerigars were sold to good homes and went to live in cages with bells and mirrors. Instead of the budgerigars, they got a canary. Dad broke up the aviary, and on the place where nothing would grow, he put down crazy paving with a little pond in the middle. He called it a patio, and to decorate it he bought a plastic orange tree in a pot and a plaster stalk to stand by the pond. Rachel didn't much like the look of the patio, but the orange tree did not die, and the stalk never said a word. That was Who's a Pretty Boy Then by Jan Mark. It was abridged for radio by Peter Carey and read by Anne Rye. Who's a Pretty Boy Then was produced in Manchester by Martin Jameson.